Greetings from Dubai here in the UAE. Thank you for joining us today on the launch of the 12th annual ASDA'A BCW Arab Youth Survey on our online platform. I am Sunil John, and I'm the president for the Middle East for BCW and also the founder of ASDA'A BCW. Our agenda today is to take you through the top 10 findings of our survey, and we have as well two very special guests who will speak to us. First, Her Excellency Shamma Al-Mazroui, the UAE Minister of State for Youth Affairs, and Dr. Jihad Azor, IMF's Director for the Middle East and Central Asia Department, who's joining us today from Washington, D.C. We will then open the floor for questions from you. You could send questions on the tab at the bottom of your screen, or post them on our social media channels, or in fact, send us an email to ays@bcw-global.com. Today, we are presenting the highlights of the survey, and you can download and read them by accessing our website, arabyouthsurvey.com. I now hand over to my colleague Nidal for a brief introduction in Arabic. Thank you.
شكرا سنيل. أسعد الله أوقاتكم بكل خير، ويسعدنا حضوركم جميعا في هذه المناسبة التي تجمعنا عبر المنصة الرقمية وجميع قنوات التواصل الاجتماعي التابعة لأرب يوث سيرفي. يسعدنا التواجد معكم اليوم. أنا نضال الأسعد، نائب أول للرئيس في شركة أصداء BCW. الحضور الكريم، ضمن أجندتنا لهذا اليوم سنستعرض أهم ملامح استطلاع أصداء BCW لرئيس الشباب العربي في نسخته 12. وبعد ذلك يسرنا أن نستضيف ضيفة الشرف معالي شمة المزروعي، وزيرة الدولة لشؤون الشباب ورئيس مجلس إدارة المؤسسة الاتحادية للشباب، التي ستعطي بعض التعليقات حول نتائج هذا الاستطلاع. كما يسرنا استضافة الدكتور جهاد أزعور، مدير إدارة الشرق الأوسط وآسيا في صندوق النقد الدولي، الذي سيشارك معنا من العاصمة الأمريكية واشنطن. سنفتح المجال لبعض الأسئلة، حيث يمكنكم استخدام الحقل الموجود في أسفل الشاشة لإرسال بعض الأسئلة، أو يمكنكم التفاعل عبر قنوات التواصل الاجتماعي، وكذلك عبر الإيميل ays@bcw-global.com. حرصا منا على وقتكم، سنقوم باستعراض ملامح هذه النتائج، ولكن بإمكانكم الحصول على التقرير المفصل مباشرة من موقعنا عبر الإنترنت ays@arabyouthsurvey.com. السيدات والسادة، نترككم الآن مع فيديو قصير حول أهم نتائج الاستطلاع. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a small video to show on the main highlight of the survey.
Welcome to the 12th edition of our annual ASDA'A BCW Arab Youth Survey. Our survey aims to understand the hearts and minds of Arab youth in the Middle East and North Africa region. The survey offers unique insight into the hopes, attitudes, and aspirations of these young Arabs. When we began our annual survey in 2008, the region was data poor on this important demographic. The survey has, over the years, filled this gap. Our survey is independent and funded entirely by our own resources, ensuring its credibility. Additionally, we provide the key findings of the survey freely on our website arabyouthsurvey.com to give governments, the private sector, and civil society organizations valuable evidence-based insights on what defines this region today and tomorrow. We are proud to present the findings of the 12th edition of the ASDA'A BCW Arab Youth Survey, which will enhance our understanding of young Arabs and support better decision-making and policy formation. This is important because our young people deserve a better future. Gives you some background of our survey and why we do that every year over the last 12 years. This year, we went into the field across 17 countries, and from based on the findings that we collected, we themed the survey A Voice for Change. And you will see from the findings that this is in fact a very apt title. Before we go into the findings, I would like to invite my colleague Dom, who will give you a brief overview of the methodology of the survey, which was conducted by international research firm PSB.
Thank you, Sunil. This year, Arab Youth Survey was conducted in two parts. The main survey from January 19 to March 3rd, before the COVID-19 pandemic fully impacted the region. For the main survey, we conducted 3,400 face-to-face interviews of young Arabs ages 18-24 in 17 Arab states across the Gulf Cooperation Council states, North Africa, and the Levant. This year, for the first time since 2011, we included young people in Syria and also spoke to Sudanese youth for the first time ever. Then, in August, we conducted a COVID-19 pulse survey through 600 face-to-face and online interviews of young Arabs in 6 countries. We did the pulse survey to better understand the impact of the pandemic on the region and its youth. Together, our sample includes a 50-50 male-female split, and we only spoke to country nationals. These 4,000 interviews across the 2 parts of the survey have led us to top 10 findings. These are not listed in any order of priority, and each of the findings is equally relevant. So let's begin with the first finding. Over to you, Sunil.
Thank you, Dom. Our first finding is focused on migration. Our survey shows that nearly half of young Arabs have considered leaving their country, and 1/3 are now even more likely to emigrate due to the COVID-19 pandemic. If you look at the data that we have collected, 2 in 5 young Arabs, that's 42%, have considered emigrating to another country, including 15% who are actively trying to leave their country. As you can see in the bar chart on the right, showing some regional splits, the number is highest in the Levantine countries at 63%. This is followed by North Africa, where nearly half of, or 47%, are considering emigrating. Young Arabs in the GCC are least likely to emigrate, with only 13% stating they have considered emigration. When you look at that 42% we talked about, where are these people who are actively considering emigration coming from? The top 4 countries there are the countries of Lebanon, Libya, Iraq, and Yemen, where at least 2 in 3 have considered leaving. Potential youth immigration is much lower in the Gulf countries, in the GCC countries, as you can see on the other end of the spectrum of this bar chart, with young Emiratis and Saudis the least likely to consider leaving their home country. We asked respondents the main reason why they are considering leaving. And the answers are really fairly obvious: struggling economies in their home countries and corruption in government. These are the two strongest drivers what forces young people to consider emigration. When we did the COVID survey, as Dom explained, in August, we found that nearly 1/3 of the Arab youth are now even more likely to emigrate due to the pandemic. The greatest impact has been on Lebanese youth, with 77% of them even more likely to emigrate to another country. A point to note here is that the COVID-19 Pulse survey was conducted shortly after the tragic Beirut port blast, which likely influenced the view of the Lebanese youth.
استطلاعنا لهذا العام ركز على العنوان الرئيسي وهو صوت لأجل التغيير، ويسرنا اليوم أن نستعرض معكم بشكل سريع أهم 10 نتائج عن هذا الاستطلاع. وركزت النتيجة الأولى للاستطلاع على موضوع الهجرة، حيث أظهرت النتائج بأن نسبة كبيرة من الشباب العرب يفكرون في الهجرة من بلادهم. نصف الشباب العرب تقريبا فكروا بمغادرة بلادهم بمعدل 2 من أصل كل 5 شباب عرب، ويرتفع هذا الاحتمال كما ترون لهجرة الشباب في البلدان التي مرت بظروف غير اعتيادية كلبنان وليبيا واليمن والعراق. وعندما سألنا الشباب العرب عن أهم الأسباب التي تدفعهم لهذه الهجرة، وجدنا الأوضاع الاقتصادية والفساد هم الدافعان الأبرز لهذه الهجرة. هناك 2 من أصل كل مشاركين في الاستطلاع أعربوا عن نيتهم عن مغادرة البلاد بشكل دائم، وترتفع هذه النسبة في دول شرق المتوسط لتصل 49%. وعندما أجرينا الاستطلاع كما ذكر زملائي في شهر أغسطس لقياس نبض تأثير كوفيد-19 على هذه النتائج، وجدنا أن قرابة ثلث الشباب يميلون إلى الهجرة نتيجة تأثيرات هذه الجائحة على المنطقة.
Our second finding is on anti-government protests that the region witnessed in 2019. These protests led to leadership changes in 4 countries: Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, and Lebanon. Hopeful for change, these young Arabs in these 4 countries support anti-government protests. And further, the survey found that the COVID-19 pandemic could lead to more political unrest. We asked the question of youth in these 4 countries that witnessed a huge number of anti-government protests on the streets. And our second finding, as you know, is related to how people feel about them. And we've seen support for anti-government protests in these 4 countries are overwhelming: 82% in Lebanon, 88% in Sudan, 89% in Algeria and Iraq both. So you see a lot of support for these anti-government protests. And then we further asked across in these 4 countries, how do they feel about these protests? Do you think it will lead to positive change, a little long-term impact, or in fact, real negative change? And here's the response. The green bars that you see are what young people feel about the protests leading to real positive change. There's some great optimism there. Young Iraqis, for example, are optimistic. Almost 82% of them feel that protests will make a positive impact. However, Lebanon, there are mixed feelings, with nearly 40% saying the protests will have little long-term impact. The Pulse survey, which we did in August, as you know, reveals that young Arabs believe the pandemic could lead to further political unrest, especially in Lebanon, with, as you can see, the bar chart on the top, 73% of young people in Lebanon feel that there'll be more protests during this period. The main reasons why young people go in for the protests during the pandemic survey that we took, as you know, that's because of lack of jobs, of inflation, high cost of living, government policy, and lack of access to healthcare.
تركز النتيجة الثانية من الاستطلاع على الاحتجاجات المناهضة للحكومة والتي هزت دولا عربية خلال عام 2019، حيث أظهرت النتائج دعم الشباب العربي في هذه الدول المناهضة للحكومة للاحتجاجات، وتعليقهم آمالا كبيرة على دورها في إحداث تغيير إيجابي. وقد حظيت احتجاجات 2019 في لبنان والجزائر والعراق والسودان بدعم واسع من شريحة الشباب في هذه الدول الأربعة، ويتوقع الشباب في هذه الدول أن تساهم هذه الاحتجاجات في إحداث تغيير إيجابي حقيقي. وعندما عدنا في شهر أغسطس وجسينا نبض الشباب العربي حول هذا الموضوع، وجدنا أن الجائحة أيضاً أضافت لهذه المعاناة وساهمت في تأجيج الاضطرابات السياسية خاصة في لبنان.
Our third finding is linked to the findings of immigration and anti-government protests, and that is about government corruption. Tackling government corruption is the top priority for Arab youth, and they say it continues despite the pandemic. 77% of Arab youth say there is government corruption in their country. This rises to more than 90% in North Africa and the Levant, as you can see in the bar charts in the regional splits that you see in the right. However, in the Gulf, 69, nearly 70% say there is no government corruption. And when we, in this connection, with this finding, we asked Arab youth on their 10-year perspective, what do they think is most important for the Arab world? And what should the Arab world prioritize to move forward for more progression? And the number one priority that Arab youth say across the 17 countries is cracking down on government corruption. That came as the number one priority, even ahead of creating new and well-paying jobs or, in fact, other political concerns. So it's a very interesting finding where young people in the age group of 18 to 24 across these 17 countries feel that cracking government corruption is the number one priority. And when we did the COVID survey, and if you can look at the bottom of the screen, you can see that nearly 76% of young Arabs say corruption is still present despite the pandemic. We also asked how they feel that how their governments have dealt with the pandemic, and Emirati and Saudi youth give high marks to their government, while a majority of the Lebanese youth disapprove of their government's handling of the pandemic.
لا شك أن هناك ترابطاً وثيقاً ما بين الاحتجاجات الشعبية والفساد، وهو الأمر الذي ركزت عليه النتيجة الثالثة للاستطلاع، حيث وضع الشباب مكافحة الفساد الحكومي على أهم أولوياتهم. كما وجدنا فيما تم استعراضه من المؤشرات بأن مكافحة الفساد الحكومي هي أولوية رئيسية عند الشباب، حيث يتفق 77% من الشباب بأن الفساد مشكلة متفشية في بلدانهم، ويرى 90% من شباب منطقتي الشرق المتوسط وشمال أفريقيا أن الفساد الحكومي منتشر بشكل واسع في دولهم. وليس مستغربا أن يرى الشباب العربي أن مكافحة الفساد الحكومي هو الأولوية القصوى لضمان تطور المنطقة حاليا وخلال السنوات العشر القادمة. وفي نظرة متفائلة بعيدا عن هذا التشاؤم، يشيد الشباب الإماراتي والسعودي بجهود حكوماتهم في مواجهة جائحة كوفيد-19.
Thank you, Nadal. So if the first three findings were more about the socio-political issues, now we're going to move to a couple findings about more of the kitchen table issues, and the fourth finding being about personal debt. So what it's showing is that that the number of young Arabs saying that they're in debt is increasing, and household debt has also risen since the pandemic. As you can see on the slide, if we go to the previous slide, please. As you can see on this slide, 1 in 3 young Arabs across the region, or 35%, say they're currently in personal debt. This marks a significant increase from the previous years. If you look at 2016, only 12% said that they were in debt, and this year it's 35%, so nearly tripled in just a few years. And if we're looking at the individual countries where young people are in personal debt, the highest number of young people being in debt are in Syria, Jordan, Palestine, and Iraq, where a majority of young people ages 18 to 24 say they do have personal debt. Meanwhile, if you look at some of the GCC countries like Kuwait, Oman, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, you will see that the levels of personal debt are fairly low. And before we look at the COVID-19 Pulse Survey, there are also some interesting findings that you will find in the full report that you can download and read on our website. We ask young people, what are the main reasons or drivers of their personal debt? And there's some interesting regional differences. While in the countries of Levant and North Africa, young people say that student debt is the primary driver of their personal debt. When you look at GCC countries and young people there, they say that car loans is the primary reason of their debt. And as for COVID-19 Pulse Survey, what we're seeing is that since the pandemic began, 30% of young people say their household debt has increased. And if you look at Levant countries, that number goes up to 40%. So nearly half of young people say their household debt has increased since the pandemic began.
Thank you, Dom. بالابتعاد عن المشهد السياسي والانتقال إلى الأمور اللي تشغل بال الشباب العربي من الناحية الشخصية، نجد أن مشكلة الشباب العربي في الديون الشخصية هي من أبرز النتائج التي خرج فيها الاستطلاع، والتي وجدوها كأهم العقبات التي تواجههم في المنطقة. هناك ارتفاع ملحوظ في عدد الشباب العربي الذين يعانون من مشكلة الديون الشخصية، حيث يقول أكثر من ثلث الشباب العربي أن لديهم ديون شخصية. وهذا الارتفاع الكبير إذا ما قرناه بنتائج 2016، حيث رصد الاستطلاع في ذلك الوقت أن هناك 12% من الشباب العربي يعانون من مشكلة الديون الشخصية، ارتفع هذا الرقم إلى 3 أضعاف ليصل إلى 35%. وإذا نظرنا إلى الموضوع من ناحية المناطق، نجد أن مشكلة الديون الشخصية أكثر تواجداً في مناطق شرق المتوسط كسوريا والأردن وفلسطين والعراق. ولكن عند سؤالنا عن نوعية هذه الديون، وجدنا أن الاستطلاع قد رصد لنا في منطقة الشرق المتوسط وشمال أفريقيا أن معظم الديون الشخصية متركزة حول القروض التعليمية، في حين أن منطقة الخليج العربي تركزت معظم مشاكل القروض الشخصية عند شراء السيارات. وفي رصد تأثير جائحة كوفيد على المسألة، لاحظنا ارتفاعا في حجم الديون الأسرية لثلث الشباب العربي منذ بدء تفشي الجائحة، مع وصول هذه النسبة إلى 50% في منطقة شرق المتوسط.
Thank you, Nadal. For our next fifth finding, we look at jobs. It's an issue that has been top of mind for years and years, ever since we started this survey. And while unemployment remains a top issue among young Arabs, what's interesting that we're seeing this year is that more young Arabs are starting to look beyond the traditional jobs in the government and private sectors. We're also seeing that due to COVID-19, finding a job has become more difficult across the region. As you can see on this slide, unemployment is an issue that a lot of young people are concerned. 87% of young Arabs say they have concerns about the issue of unemployment. But if you look at their level of confidence about their government dealing the issue of unemployment, that number drops to 49%, or only half of all young Arabs having confidence in their government being able to deal with the issue. So if 87% are concerned, only half of them have confidence in their governments on this issue. And as you will see in our full report, as I previously mentioned, it has become more difficult to find a job across the region due to COVID-19 pandemic. with 72% of young Arabs saying it is more difficult to find a job right now. And on this slide, what we're seeing is some 2019 data in blue and some data from 2020 in green. So if you look at the first bars on the left side, you'll see that a majority of young Arabs still prefer to work for either the government or private sector. But what's different is that in both cases, fewer young people in comparison to 2019 are preferring those jobs in the traditional sectors. Instead, more young Arabs are starting to prefer to work for themselves or their family. And as our full report shows, is that 2 in 5 young Arabs are actually very open and wanting to start their own business in the next 5 years. And this entrepreneurship spirit is the highest in the GCC countries.
يركز استطلاعنا في نتيجته الخامسة على موضوع البطالة، وهي موضوع شخصي يعاني منه الشباب العربي، حيث عبر معظم الشباب عن قلقهم بشأن البطالة، ولكن نصفهم فقط يثقون بقدرة الحكومة على مواجهة هذه المشكلة. هناك 9 من كل 10 أشخاص من المشاركين في الاستطلاع تقريباً أبدوا قلقهم من مشكلة البطالة، ونصفهم فقط يثقون بقدرة الحكومة على مواجهة هذه المشكلة. ومع أن غالبية الشباب العرب لا يزالون يفضلون العمل لصالح الحكومة أو القطاع الخاص، إلا أن بدأنا نرى عددا منهم يرغبون في العمل المستقل أو العالي، وذلك بشكل متزايد لهذا الاستطلاع. نسبة كبيرة من الشباب العرب وتحديدا في منطقة مجلس التعاون الخليجي ربما يتوجهون إلى إطلاق أعمالهم الخاصة. ولا شك أيضا بأن تداعيات جائحة كوفيد قد زادت الأمر سوءا، حيث يعتقد 72% من الشباب العرب أن فرصة العمل مع هذه الجائحة قد أصبحت أكثر صعوبة.
We now move to Washington, D.C., where we have a special message from Dr. Jihad Azur, Director of the IMF's Middle East and Central Asia Department. Over to you, Dr. Jihad. It is, I know, early morning for you in DC, and we really appreciate that you've taken time to join us today for this special online event. Over to you, Dr. Jihad.
Sunil, good afternoon, and good afternoon to all your team. First, allow me to congratulate you for this new release of the Arab Youth Survey. It's a very interesting and a timely report that shows the importance of the challenges and the aspirations of the Arab youth. Last year, when we were launching together the report, I said that the region needs a new social contract where the youth will be or should be at the center stage. Clearly, after the COVID-19, this aspiration is getting more and more importance. And this for several reasons. I think the region is going, like other parts of the world, through disruptions and accelerations. And the survey is reflecting that. Some of the disruptions is the feel of many Arab youth for the need to immigrate in order to find job opportunities and build their future. Aspirations, we saw also that many of the Arab youth are encouraged to build their own future by being more entrepreneurial, by valuing the importance of gender equality, and also by having a glimpse of aspiration and optimism. Therefore, we cannot build the future of the Middle East, the future of the Arab world, without investing on our most important value, which is the youth. For that, countries need to have, for the recovery, certain number of priorities. The first one is build the talents and provide them access. We saw this is one of the most important issues that the Arab youth are currently facing, which is this challenge of high level of unemployment. One of the highest rate of unemployment in the world is in our countries. And therefore it's very important to provide an opportunity for the private sector, for entrepreneurs to build the next opportunities and to allow the Arab youth to find their aspirations in the region. Second is provide through education access to talent. Education especially has been challenged with the COVID-19 crisis, and also is showing that investing in education, investing in technology is one of the best ways to accelerate and to strengthen the recovery. Addressing issues of governance. This is also an important issue that the young people of the Arab world are aspiring to rebuild confidence between them and the state. And therefore, reforming the state, modernizing it, tackling the issue of corruption that is considered by many of the Arab youth as the most important challenge is going to be priority for the future. Last but not the least, benefiting from all the talents and promoting more gender equality will be for the Arab region a way to accelerate transformation. Indeed, the whole world lives through uncertainty, and including the region too. And the best way to address those issues of uncertainties and to build a better future is to use surveys like the one you're providing in order to better understand where the challenges are, but also how we can transform these challenges into opportunities, and how we can make a region that has huge talents one of the leading regions in the recovery for the next decade. With that, I would like to, again, thank you for this excellent material that we all in our institutions, and I hope also decision makers of the region, will spend some time looking at the details of this survey in order to find the right policies and also set the priorities right. With that, I will wish you all the best and also all the success in this report for this year. Thank you very much, Sunil.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Jihad. Our next finding is on identity, and we see that religion is the single most important factor to young people in the region, more so than any other single thing, including family or nationality. 2 in 5 young Arabs, that's 40%, say that religion is the most important factor in their identity, even more than their family tribe, their nationality, their Arab heritage, their political beliefs, their language, or their gender. While religion is important right across the region, there are big regional differences, and you'll see that it's most important in North Africa. If you look above the bar chart, you can see those regional splits. In Algeria, Sudan, and Egypt, more than 2/3 of young people say it's the most defining aspect of their identity. In the Gulf, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, religion does not play such a central role. In particular, only 8% of UAE nationals see religion as the defining factor of their identity. Instead, 54% mentioned their nationality. Nevertheless, a majority of Arab youth still believe that religion plays too big a role in the region. This is something that we saw last year. And 66% of young Arabs, 2/3, also feel that religious institutions need to be reformed, although we have seen a drop in that number from last year.
أظهرت إحدى نتائج استطلاعنا للسنة الماضية بأن الشباب العرب كانوا يتساءلون عن دور المؤسسات الدينية، وكنا نعتقد في هذاك الوقت بأن الشباب قد غيروا رأيهم بما يتعلق بأهمية الدين، ولكن النتيجة السادسة التي توصل إليها استطلاعنا هذا العام أكدت بأن الشباب العربي لا زال ينظر إلى الدين باعتباره جوهريا لهويتهم الشخصية، بل هو أكثر أهمية من الانتماء العائلي أو حتى الوطني، حيث يعتقد بعض منهم 2 من كل شاب عربي بأن 2 من أصل 5 شباب عرب يعتقدون بأن الدين يشكل جوهرا لهويتهم. وما زال الدين مهما للهوية وتشكيل الهوية بالنسبة لمختلف المناطق، ولكنه أكثر أهمية كما وجد الاستطلاع في دول شمال أفريقيا. ويعد الدين أقل أهمية من ناحية أخرى في هوية الشباب في منطقة دول مجلس التعاون الخليجي، خاصة الإماراتيين والعمانيين. ولكن السعوديين يختلفون في هذا الإطار، حيث اختار 60% منهم أن الدين هو الجانب الأهم في تحديد هويتهم الشخصية. أما جانب الانتماء الوطني فكانت هوية الشباب الإماراتي مهمة بالنسبة لهم من الناحية الوطنية بنسبة 45%، مقارنة ب8% من الشباب الإماراتي الذين يعتقدون أن الدين يشكل الجانب الأهم من تحديد هويتهم.
Our next finding shows that most young Arab women feel they have the same rights as men. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, they have seen an increase in both job and family responsibilities for women in the Arab world. As mentioned, half of our sample, 50%, are women, and we wanted to ask them about their rights and opportunities. And the data reveals that a strong majority, 64%, of young Arab women say they have the same rights as men, and another 11% feel they have even more rights than men. Like many of our findings where we see big regional splits, that isn't the case in this instance. It's fairly constant answers across the GCC, North Africa, and the Levant. And the same sentiment holds true when we asked young Arab women about their education and employment opportunities. The majority say they have the same rights as men in accessing quality education and finding a career. However, if you look at the data in our full report, you'll see that with the pandemic, young Arabs believe that those work and family responsibilities have increased for women in the region. Another data point that might be of interest is that the majority of young Arab women and men say that they feel a woman can benefit the family most if she works either full-time or part-time rather than staying at home.
وأخيراً لدينا نتيجة يمكن الإنسان يبتسم لها في ظل هذه الظروف، والنتيجة السابعة التي جاءت مفاجأة يمكن للناس اللي من خارج المنطقة فيما يتعلق بحقوق الجنسين، حيث ترى معظم الشابات العربيات بنسبة 64% بأنهن يتمتعن بحقوق متساوية مع الرجال، في حين تعتقد 11% منهن أن المرأة تحظى بحقوق أفضل من الرجل، والربع 25% يعتبرن الرجال أفضل منهن في الحقوق. واللافت الانتباه هنا بأن عكس ما أظهرته النتائج من تفاوت بين المناطق الجغرافية الثلاثة التي غطاها الاستطلاع في النتائج السابقة، يكاد تكون هذه النتيجة الوحيدة التي اتفق عليها العرب، حيث جاءت النتيجة متناغمة حول حقوق الجنسين. أما بالنسبة للفرص التعليمية فتعتبر الشابات 70% منهم بأن فرصهم التعليمية متساوية مع الرجال، ولكن هذه النسبة تنخفض عندما يتعلق بالفرص المهنية، إذ ترى 52% من النساء أنهن يتمتعن بنفس فرص الرجال، بينما يعتبر 35% منهن أن الرجال يحظون بفرص أكبر للتطور المهني. سنيل.
Our next finding is on model nations. It highlights, and this finding highlights a very clear trend that we have seen over the last 9 years. The UAE remains the top country for that young Arabs would like to live in and for their own countries to emulate. This data comes from the fact that when we looked at asking these questions across these 17 countries, 46% of them selected the UAE ahead of a list of more than 30 major Western and Eastern nations, including those in the region as well. And as you can see here, the bar charts on the left, UAE came in as 46%, as I said, followed by the United States at 33%, 27% votes for Canada, 27 again for the UK, and then Germany comes in at 22%. This has been a prevailing trend, as I said, since we introduced this question in the 2012 survey. And it's an interesting trend that continues with our next question when we ask them, which country would these young people want their own countries to emulate? And there again, the UAE comes as their top choice. In fact, even more, 52% say UAE is the country that their own country should emulate, followed, of course, by the United States at 30%, Germany at 23%, Canada at 21%, and another 20% coming in for Japan. So that's how one looks at the prevailing trends. And then we kind of ask the question in terms of what do people, these young people across these 17 countries, what do they associate the UAE for? And look at that, in some very obvious ones, safety and security. 44% mentioned that as their top association, followed by 36% looking at wide range of work opportunities, another 32% for generous salary packages. And then, of course, 31% talking about UAE as a growing economy, 25% a good place to raise a family, 24% again, easy to start a business. And of course, 24% welcoming, that UAE is welcoming to and friendly to expatriates. A high quality education system, that's what 23% of the young people across these 17 countries identified as an association. And then, of course, 20% respecting cultural traditions, and another 17% saying that the UAE has a strong cultural heritage. Nidal?
في بارقة أمل لتجربة عربية ناجحة، وفي إطار بحثنا السنوي على البلد المثالي الذي يفضله الشباب العربي، واصلت دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة نجاحها للعام التاسع على التوالي في تصدر لائحة البلد المفضل في المنطقة الذي يرنو الشباب العربي للعيش فيه، ويريدون لبلدانهم أن تقتدي به. فعند سؤالهم عن أكبر بلد يتطلعون للعيش فيه، اختار نصف المشاركين في الاستطلاع دولة الإمارات. ودولة الإمارات هنا حلت في المرتبة الأولى قبل الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وكندا والمملكة المتحدة وألمانيا، وكانت البلد العربي الوحيد في هذه القائمة. وما تزال الإمارات أيضا من ناحية أخرى البلد المفضل عند الشباب العربي الذين يرغبون لبلدانهم أن تحتدي بهذه التجربة الناجحة، وجاءت في المرتبة الأولى أيضا قبل الولايات المتحدة وألمانيا وكندا واليابان وغيرها من البلدان الأخرى. ومن أهم الأسباب التي سألنا الشباب العربي عن تفضيلهم لدولة الإمارات، جاءتنا أهم كثير من الأسباب في الواقع، ولكن من أهمها كان الأمن والأمان، فرص العمل، والرواتب السخية، واللي هي جعلتها مفضلة عند الشباب العربي. دوم.
Thank you, Nidal. Our next finding is focused on foreign relations, showing that young Arabs view Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the United States as the three rising powers in the region. Then asked which Arab countries have increased their influence in the region over the past 5 years the most, Saudi Arabia and the UAE rise to the top, as you can see in the bar chart on the left side, at 39% and 34% respectively. When asked about the regional influence of non-Arab countries, the bar chart on the right side shows that the US has increased its influence in the region the most, considerably higher than that of Turkey, Russia, or Iran. We also ask young Arabs how they perceive other countries as allies or adversaries of their own countries. And as you can see in this graph, UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia all enjoy very strong perceptions of 89% saying the UAE is an ally of their country, 80% saying the same about Egypt, and 78% saying the same about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. If you look down at the list, United States, 56% view the US as an ally. And then if you look at Iran, a majority, 64%, say Iran is an enemy of their country. And here, we've been asking this question for the past 5 years, and we have some interesting tracking data. So if you look at the green bars, they show how perceptions of the UAE have changed from 2016 to 2020. And if in 2016, 72% viewed UAE as an ally, this year it has jumped all the way to 89%. If you look at the blue bars for Saudi Arabia, perception of Saudi Arabia went up from 70% viewing the kingdom as an ally in 2016 to 78% this year. And the gray bars for United States, there's some very interesting shifts there. If you look at 2016, 63% said US was an ally. It was the last year under President Obama. Then as President Trump came into office, perceptions of the US declined significantly from 46% in 2017, 35% in 2018, but have recovered this year quite significantly, nearly to the levels of 2016, with 56% of young Arabs saying US is an ally of their country.
وفي النتيجة التاسعة التي تركز على العلاقات الدولية، يرى الشباب العربي بأن السعودية والإمارات والولايات المتحدة أنها القوى الأكثر تأثيرا في المنطقة. فعند سؤالهم عن القوى التي زاد تأثيرها في المنطقة خلال السنوات الخمس الماضية، تصدرت دولة الإمارات بنسبة 39% والسعودية بنسبة 34%. وينظر غالبية الشباب العربي إلى الإمارات العربية والسعودية كدولتين حليفتين، فيما انقسمت آراؤهم وتطلعاتهم حيال الولايات المتحدة. وترسخت الصورة الإيجابية حيال الإمارات والسعودية خلال السنوات الخمس الماضية، فيما بدأت الولايات المتحدة تدريجيا باستعادة مكانتها، وإمكانكم أن تشاهدون هذا بشكل مفصل من خلال التقرير المفصل للاستطلاع. أما إذا نظرنا إلى جائحة كوفيد وتأثيرها، نجد أن الشباب العربي ينظر إلى الحكومتين الصينية والإماراتية كالأكفأ على الاستجابة لجائحة كوفيد والتعامل مع تحدياتها. Margaret?
Thank you, Nadal. And our final finding shows that young Arabs are clearly embracing the digital revolution and that there has been considerable growth in online and e-commerce since the pandemic began. Looking at tracking data over the last 6 years, you'll see there's been a steady growth in social media to become the most common source of news for Arab youth. If you look at the green bars, back in 2015, only 25% of young Arabs got their news from social media. Fast track to 2020, and you'll see that around 4 in 5, 79%, now say they get their news on social. In the dark blue bars, you'll see that television has been remaining steady, back at 60% in 2015 and at 56% today. Our data also shows that young people have fully embraced e-commerce and online shopping. Just 2 years ago, in 2018, 53% of young Arabs said they shopped online. 2 years down the road, 2020, you'll see that this year, an overwhelmingly 80% of young Arabs shop online, and with the pandemic, we've seen that that's increased still further. Nadal.
Thank you, Margaret. حقا إنه الجيل الرقمي، وعند النظر لهذه النتيجة العاشرة من الاستطلاع، أصبحت الثورة الرقمية جزءا لا يتجزأ من الحياة اليومية للشباب العربي، وتمام دور وسائل الإعلام الاجتماعي لتصبح المصدر الأكثر شيوعا للأخبار لدى الشباب بنسبة 97%، مقارنة ب 25% في عام 2015. فإذا قفزة كبيرة في هذا الموضوع. أما التلفاز فلا يزال يحافظ على مستوى ثابت يتراوح ما بين 56 إلى 60% كمصدر رئيسي للأخبار. أصبحت الهواتف الذكية أهم وسيلة في متناول الشباب العربي للترفيه ومشاهدة محتوى الفيديو. وبما أن الحديث هنا بلغة الأرقام والجيل الرقمي، فاسمحوا لي أن أتحدث ببعض الأرقام الرئيسية لتظهر مدى اهتمام الشباب العربي بالثورة الرقمية. 62% من الشباب العربي يستخدمون هواتفهم كأداة أساسية لمشاهدة محتوى الفيديو. 53% منهم مشتركون في خدمة بث الفيديو عبر الإنترنت. 62% مشتركون في خدمة بث الموسيقى، و80% من الشباب العربي يتسوقون عبر الإنترنت. ولكن ولا شك أن ما أثرت فيه جائحة كوفيد على المنطقة أدت إلى مزيد من الاستخدام لهذه الوسائل الرقمية والتي أدت لتحول الشباب إلى الثورة الرقمية.
So those are the top 10 findings that we have brought to you. A quick recap of the findings. We see the first three findings on migration, on anti-government protests, and on corruptions to be kind of interlinked. These are socio-political problems in these 17 countries, and where nearly half of these young Arabs want to leave their country because of lack of opportunity and because of government corruption. And they're frustrated with those struggling economies. An overwhelming number of these young people also support the anti-government protests in their own countries. And a majority of them see that the number one priority for the Arab world is to be able to tackle government corruption. The next two findings, of course, are on personal debt and jobs. And as Dom mentioned, these are kitchen table issues, and we see debt increasing considerably, especially after the COVID pandemic. Similarly, a higher trend in terms of unemployment. And as all of you know, the International Labour Organization report that the Arab world has the highest youth unemployment at over 26%. And we think possibly during the pandemic, this number would have worsened. The next few slides, Margaret took us through the question of identity, where Arabs see religion as a defining factor of their personal identity, more so than family or nationalities. But we also saw some very interesting regional differences where the religion aspect was more apparent in the North African countries, while in the Levant, to a much lesser extent, and very little in the Gulf. So you see some very interesting regional differences there. The finding on the gender rights is actually a very surprising one, because it challenges the stereotypes on women in the region. I think the fact that a majority of the young women say that they have the same rights as men, especially in terms of access to quality education as well as to professional job opportunities. Then, of course, one of our most important findings is how young Arabs see model nations. And here again, the UAE comes as the number one choice over the last 9 years. And this clearly is a development model that has really been successful. In fact, young people see that as a better example than ones in the Western countries as well as the Eastern countries. In foreign relations, we're seeing a continuing trend there of young people looking at their own in terms of powerful allies, and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates come in as the top two choices as the power centers in the Middle East. Of course, among the non-Arab players, the United States has seen a very good jump in terms of how young people see them as, where a majority of them see them as an ally. And finally, the digital generation that we see, I think young people are adopting and embracing the digital revolution that we see in the space. And you can see those numbers going up, especially on using social media as a source for news, and the use of online and e-commerce platforms, a huge upward trend. So those are the top 10 findings. I hope you found them interesting. And we wanted to, at this point of time, share some very interesting and especially inspiring news that we have got. His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the UAE Vice President and the Prime Minister and the ruler of Dubai, has tweeted some of the top results, the findings of the survey. And we are truly honored and thank His Highness for recognizing our work and encouraging us to bring this valuable data and insight to this public forum. And these are the three tweets that he did earlier today. The first one is interesting. He says, His Highness says that the UAE model has been seen as a successful model. 46% of the young people see this as the UAE as a model country. And he says very importantly, he says the UAE is a country for all people, and that the doors of the UAE are open for people from across the world. The second tweet that he put out is about that 77% of the Arab youth feel strongly that there is an increase in government corruption, and that 78% are concerned about rising unemployment. And he further explains that very strongly, that he says the governments that do not tackle these problems of government corruption and unemployment will be destroyed, and that people will leave. The final tweet that he's put out today, again, is probably one of the strongest, where he, of course, compliments ASDA'A BCW for showcasing these findings. But he does express the fact that half of Arab youth, nearly half of Arab youth wanting to emigrate, as a very tragic and sad finding, that the Arab youth want to leave their countries. And he says it is obvious, because what young people want is safety and security and an opportunity to progress in life. We thank His Highness again for these wonderful insights and words of encouragement, and for pointing out the key findings to all of you in this public forum. We now would like to move on to a small message, a short message from Her Excellency, the UAE Minister of State for Youth Affairs, Shamma Al-Mazroui. She is also the chairperson of the Federal Youth Authority. Over to Her Excellency.
Data is power. The Arab Youth Survey calls upon us as leaders and youth alike to exercise our moral imagination. That is, the courage to see reality as it is, and the audacity to hope and work for a better tomorrow. The most important finding was the finding on hope, I believe. That hope revealed begins with loss. In 2020, in the results, 50% of Arab youth consider leaving their countries for a better life, and 40% want to leave their country permanently, driven predominantly by economic reasons, by education opportunities, by security. What does this data really mean? It suggests that many Arab youth don't believe their systems work for their lives. It implies that they don't believe that they have a voice. It indicates a loss of hope. And this is precisely why this data can help us all, globally and in this region. The survey data reveals what happens if and when governments and leaders don't listen to youth. And this is why I equally believe the reality of the Arab Youth Survey points to hope, because it gives youth a voice to tell us exactly what they think, who they are, what they want. Youth gave us the raw data, and the answers are in plain sight. So now we can shine a light of hope on both the loss and needs, as well as the ideas and dreams of Arab youth, and forge a new path forward, letting data lead the way. What does the data mean? First of all, youth tell us that transparent and cooperative leadership is the #1 issue for youth. They want leadership that listens. It is unequivocally clear that Arab youth have a demand for integrity and a hope for positive change in their nations and throughout their lives. They believe that their voice can make a difference. They are ready to migrate to where they can engage with leadership, and they're willing to be part of the solution. This is critical for governments throughout the Arab world to pay attention to. The issues that are affecting youth require systemic attention. In addition to migration, unemployment remains the top issue among Arab youth. Only 50% have confidence in their government to create infrastructure to address their employment needs and concerns. Young Arabs are also migrating away from traditional government and private sector jobs to showing an increased interest in entrepreneurship and non-traditional work. In fact, in the GCC, 55% of youth said that they would like to start their own businesses within the next 5 years. Think of this. A wave of innovation is coming and youth are leading the way. How will governments harness this energy and the talent of youth to drive new economies and social solutions? The innovation and growth opportunities that youth present are phenomenal and prime for governments to begin tackling them. Because the alternatives are unacceptable, the growing gaps in youth education, youth employment, youth positive engagement create ripe conditions for extremist recruits. Nature for all, and after all, abhors vacuum. And as we've seen far too often the past 10 years, hopelessness results when youth are not employed. Apathy results when youth are not seen as assets. Violence results when youth are not valued. Uprisings result when youth are not uplifted. And it's up to all of us, especially governments, to create an ecosystem of positive opportunities, identity, belonging, and purpose for youth. And this is the key to all of our 21st century economy solutions. Our focus must be on bringing in the light of opportunity, not simply trying to conquer the darkness of its absence. And every day in the United Arab Emirates, we work to make that mission a reality, so the voice of every Emirati youth shapes every sector of policy and society. And central to achieving our mission is the philosophy and consistent daily practice of directly engaging with youth. And to keep that simple, engagement is the method of gathering inputs. Engagement is listening. Engagement is data collection, data capture. Engagement is purposeful and inclusive. And engagement is making youth and their input a core part of our operating manual. Engaging and empowering youth is central to the United Arab Emirates Youth Strategy, and we believe this is reflected in the numbers and in the Arab Youth Survey as well. For the 9th year in a row, Arab youth rank the United Arab Emirates as the top nation to emulate, citing safety, security, well-paying work opportunities, and a good place to raise a family. And we are so proud to receive this acknowledgement from youth throughout the region. And we know how much this work invites us to do so much more throughout the MENA nations. I'm so proud to come from a country that doesn't have an archived national youth strategy. Our youth strategy is a living, breathing, evolving model that translates true voice of youth into action. Our model is driven by the inclusion of youth, and the rewards are worth the risks. The Arab Youth Survey is truly a voice for change and must be a map for governments to equip, engage, and empower their youth. The UAE government believes that we exist to help all youth reach their full potential. And the Arab Youth Survey is unmistakable call to work together as Arab nations. And we know it's a tall order worth filling. And we're making our national youth model available to everyone. Information without action is empty. Action without data is careless. And this Arab Youth Survey provides an ideal compass for policymakers throughout the region to address real challenges facing youth that are the core issues of our nations, our region, and the world. And the data is clear. The greater risk is not taking radical risks to empower, engage young people. I invite you all to join the new narrative of hope for youth. As a young person, use your voice. As a leader, listen and act. As an adult, facilitate, mentor, encourage. As an organization, open doors and ignite. Hope through leadership in listening, action, and ultimate growth into a thriving 21st century region. The future is hope, and the future is youth. And if we are wise, empowered youth will reach and lead the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for that inspiring and positive message. Indeed, let us all join hands to create the new narrative of hope for youth. I wanted to also thank all of you who joined us today for this online launch of our 12th ASDA'A BCW Arab Youth Survey. We look forward to your feedback and your comments. But before you leave, we wanted to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask questions. We've seen a number of you send us questions on the tab at the bottom of your screen. You can still ask those questions, and we are here ready to answer them. And we will take up those questions straight away now. But before that, please remember that you can download the latest the white paper of the findings on our website arabyouthsurvey.com, where you have a lot of material to be able to look and study, and do connect with us at any point of time if you need further information, further explanation. In the white paper, we have got 7 experts commenting on those findings, which will give you more context in terms of what do these findings mean for the world, and especially for the Arab world region as well. So over to the questions. Maybe we take up the first question from, we see here Ms. Tala Al-Ramahi asking a question. She says, very interesting insights. I have a question on when did you conduct this survey, and specifically the question on Arab youth's preference for which country they'd like to live in and the perception of allies versus enemies. We have here my colleague Dom from PSB. Dom, would you like to take that question?
Sure. Thanks, Sunil. Good question. As mentioned previously, this year we did things a bit differently, and we conducted the survey in two parts. The main survey, where these questions came from that are being referred to in the question, were part of the main survey. That main survey was conducted from January 19 to March 3rd. So before the impact of COVID-19 truly hit the region and its youth.
So in fact, the question that you asked, Tala, about the country preferences came out in the March survey. And why we did the COVID survey is to see how things have impacted young people. And we've seen that it has, in certain cases, worsened things, and certain things they have remained steady. So the perception of, I hope that answers your question. There's another question which is about what can the region do to stop its young people from wanting to leave? Now that is a very difficult question for us to answer, but I think within the insight there are answers. There's one particular question that we asked young people about their 10-year perspective. What do they want the Arab world to do? And the first one was about tackling government corruption. What does that actually mean when in terms of context? I mean, what young people are saying is that they want opportunity to do a work, opportunity to create, to set up a family, and opportunity to move ahead in life, to be able to contribute to the national progress of their own countries. That is a very simple, pragmatic ask of these young people. And clearly, I think if governments are focused on that, what they would look at is creating more education for young people, more quality education systems, and then creating jobs and creating a workforce that is fit for the future, for them to be able to take up more work in the private sector or even be entrepreneurs. And we're seeing that movement, especially in the Gulf countries. So the request from what the voice of change is all about is that how do you create those education systems that create the workforce for the future? How do you create an environment where young people have the ability not only to get into private sector, but also to look at new entrepreneurial ventures? I think the governments in most countries are maxed out. They can't create more jobs. The private sector has a responsibility to be able to become an important part of the economy and to create those jobs. So very simple, good quality education, more job opportunities, and tackling government corruption. There is a word, a euphemistic word that people use in the region. It's called wasta. And wasta means somebody having connections in government so that doors open for them. They want wasta to go. They want equal opportunity. And that's what the young people in the region want. I hope that answers your question. In fact, we think that what young people are saying are pragmatic. And what His Highness said is that if countries don't look at this, they will be destroyed. And I think it is about time that governments focus on creating a future for these young people. Another question is about what are the major changes between the findings before and after COVID? Dom, would you like to take that question?
Sure. Thanks, Sunil. In some ways, some findings actually are very consistent. If you look at levels of government corruption, if you look at how central religion is to one's identity, They're very similar to what we saw before COVID from January to March. But in some ways, we're seeing that it's less about being major changes or differences. It's more about that, some things are actually progressed in the wrong way or worsened. So if we're looking at personal debt, we see that 30% saying their household debt has increased since the pandemic began. If we look at jobs, young people are saying that it has become more difficult for them to find jobs, and unemployment has already been such a big issue, and the pandemic making it even more difficult. It's definitely something that we'll probably see even next year when we do next year's report. Another point about jobs is that what we saw in the COVID-19 Pulse survey was that 20% of young Arabs said that they or someone in their household lost a job due to COVID-19. So it's definitely, this pandemic is having a big negative impact on the financial things and economies across the region.
Thank you, Dom. There is a question, an interesting one from Mohammed Agrabawi from Jordan. He finds the report very insightful, but he asked a question. He said, has the report provided any recommendations on how to sort out these issues? Have we asked young people, how do they see the way forward? How do they see their role as youth in solving these problems? I think, thank you, Mohammed, for asking that question. And I want to clarify here that as a firm that does these reports and brings it out in the public forum, including the white paper, is to spark discussion, to focus governments and private sector and institutions, including international multilateral institutions, on the key problems of the region. That is our job. But our job is, it does not finish there, of course, but we also, in addition, brought the experts to explain this and recommend what we need, what the government needs to do. So do read the white paper, and you will see those recommendations, especially coming from the experts, the 7 experts we have in the white paper. You ask one other question is, did we ask young people how they see the way forward? Yes, we did. And one of those is, what is their perspective over the next 10 years? Not only for the Arab world, but also on a personal front. And their responses are very clear. Tackling government corruption, creating more jobs, looking at better opportunities to be able to get good quality education. So you will see all of those reports. Do spend some time reading the white report, and you'll get most of those answers. Thank you, Mohammed, for that question. Ajay Dayal asks another interesting, he finds the report very interesting. I would like to know how the size of the sample being surveyed across the mentioned countries. Dom, would you like to take that question?
Sure, I get all the fun questions today about
You're the research guy.
Exactly. So as mentioned previously, we did things a bit differently this year, and the survey was conducted in 2 parts. So the main survey, we did 3,400 interviews face-to-face across 17 countries. So we did 200 interviews in each country, each of the 17 countries. And then for the COVID Pulse survey, we did an extra 600 interviews face-to-face and online across 6 countries. So together, if you look at it, it's a pretty big sample size. Margin of error is only plus or minus 1.7%. So we're very confident in our data, and that what we're seeing is actually reflects what people are feeling on the streets.
There is one question coming from Anonymous. He says, is this a survey funded by any government? Are there any sponsors for this survey? Dom, would you like to answer that question?
Again, all the fun questions. No, this survey has been independently funded by our agency from the very beginning. And as Sunil has mentioned, we did this back in 2008 because we saw that the region really lacked hard data to understand its populations. And if you think about it, over 60% of people in the Arab world are under the age of 30. And because of that, we focus on young people and what they're feeling, what their hopes and aspirations are. But no one is funding the study besides us. We invest our time and resources into this. And it's largely driven by Sunil, because that's truly his passion project over the past 12 years.
Thank you, Dom. I think we often get asked this question. I mean, this has been our contribution to the market in which we work, and we have got fantastic compliments from various people in the society, both within the region and outside. The IMF, for example, Dr. Jihad Azur has been a big constant support, because these are credible information. It is quoted by the best media vehicles across the world, from The Economist to the Financial Times to New York Times, as well as Washington Post, which have reported these findings. And that is the reason why, because they are credible, they are independent and fully funded by our firm. There is a question about women's rights. I mean, that's one of our stunning findings this year, that young women see themselves as having equal opportunity. The question again comes from Tala Ramahi from Abu Dhabi, where she asks, was there a predefined understanding of participants as to what these rights meant in terms of the structure of the question, Dom? I'm sorry, I have to pass those questions to you. How did you structure that questionnaire? And then as perceptions on what does equal rights mean? It may differ from person to person or even country to country. You're right, Tala. I think if we can attempt to answer that question, it's not an easy one to answer, but Dom, if you can look at how the question was structured and how we fielded that question among these young people. Remember, these are face-to-face interviews. They're not online. So we take a lot of pains to be able to do those so we can get actually the real slice of life responses from these young people.
Thank you, Sunil. To answer, yes, not an easy question to answer. What we do with our survey, we never defined what we mean by rights or equal rights for people, because that would, my definition of rights or equal rights might not be the same as someone else's definition. And we don't want to bias respondents, on our definition of what rights or equal rights means. In my view, the important thing to note on those questions is the equal or greater or lesser part in comparison to men. It's less about, I think, rights, but young people know what rights, what freedoms, opportunities they have, and they're able to very easily compare to young men what their rights are and opportunities are. So I think I would encourage to focus on the part that young women feel like they have the same or even greater rights than men in their countries, and also access to quality education and opportunities, professional opportunities. Well, that's a little lower than, let's say, quality education and rights in general, but it's something probably if you went and fielded the same question in any country in the world, I think we would see that, when it comes to jobs and careers, there's still things stacked against women more so than men.
There's a question from Fahim Ahmed who says, would you plan to extend the survey next year to include Arab youth in Europe and Americas and benchmark between the two? Fahim, if you remember, way back in 2008 in our first survey, we actually compared the perceptions of youth in Western economies versus youth in the Middle East, and we saw some interesting contrast there. You suggest a very interesting idea, and the Arab diaspora in Americas and Europe are increasing, and I think it's an important question to ask, and we will look at it. Of course, this is a question about budgets, but I think you've suggested something very interesting, and we will look into it for sure. There is one question, general question for all three of us, which is, what are the two most interesting findings that each of us see? Would you like to start with you, Nidal? I think we haven't heard from you.
Thank you very much. Actually, the gender rights, finding was one of the main ones. But for me, as a favorite one, how the Arab youth has seen the religion itself. I mean, last year, as you know, Sunil, in our survey, we have focused on the need for restructuring the religious institutions.
Yes.
And we thought that religion is not a key factor for the Arab youth. But when we look at this finding this year, and we found that religion is a key factor of the youth identity, and they still see it part of their, who they are and what they represent. This is something interesting and need to really to analyze. And also the structure of how the North Africa, Levant, seeing this differently from the GCC countries, with the exception of Saudi Arabia. When you see the UAE nationals, they focus on national identity, more religion, which has some global citizenship element in their thinking.
Yes, indeed. While I think you're right, the finding on religion defining personality is a very, very interesting one. But the differences in the region is what makes that finding even more interesting. But I found the finding on migration that nearly half of all Arab youth want to leave the country to be an insightful finding, but also a tragic and sad finding, as His Highness Sheikh Mohammed described that finding as well. I think that is a signal for the leaders in the region to really focus on a long-term perspective, to create a plan that can build. This can't be built overnight, but we need to start somewhere. And that is what His Highness Sheikh Mohammed has really said in his tweet. And I think that is the clear focus. I think that is a red flag for everyone to see, not only for the Middle East region, but also for neighboring continents, because where do these people want to go? This is an issue that needs to be addressed by the global community as well, to be able to bring the Arab world into the future and to make sure that its young people have opportunities to grow and stay in the region and build their countries, of course. So that's the finding I found most interesting. What about you, Dom?
Yeah, I'm going to cheat a little bit and give more than one finding. I totally agree with you, Sunil and Adal, that the religion and immigration findings are very interesting. For me, as someone who works in research, I always get excited when I see a lot of changes in data over the years. And that's one of the key benefits of doing this survey over the last 12 years, is that you can measure how perceptions have changed. So to me, what's really interesting this year has been that personal debt among young people, young Arab people, has nearly tripled from 2016 to 2020. Now 35% say they're in debt. Personal debt in itself is not a bad thing, but it's about being able to afford repaying that debt. And what we're seeing that some young people might struggle to do that. A couple other big changes that I'm seeing this year is one on perceptions of United States. We saw the dip in 2017, and it's now going back up to the levels, before 2016, 2015. So we're seeing shifts how U.S. is perceived. And then another thing that I think is super interesting is the young people truly, maybe not surprising, but young people truly embracing the digital revolution. If you look at e-commerce, it's booming in the region, and it's driven by young people going online and shopping online and creating new opportunities, a new industry for a region, and jobs for young people. So those would be my more than one interesting finding.
We probably have to end this broadcast very soon, but I'd probably have time to take one question, and that's from Carlene Gerbich. The question is, did any of those questions about the levels of debt express any concern about financial position? Is there a potential cause for concern in the near and midterms? I think definitely there is a potential for cause of concern. I think, of course, debt even in Western countries among young people is high. We know the numbers even in the United States, where young people are constrained by debt and they pay back their student loans over a very long period of time. So our region is not very different from another. But the differences in debt is, in the Levant and North Africa, you're looking at debt for student loans, but in the Gulf, it's about car loans, because most education is paid for by the government in the Gulf. So there are some differences. Would I say there is a cause for concern? I feel not yet. I think, but that is something that governments, banks, central banks should be looking at very, very closely. Probably, while the debt should be very closely monitored, but lines of credit should be open for young people who need to be able to start new businesses, and that's the most important thing. And if you dig a little deeper, there is not enough credit lines open for young people on that. Maybe one last question from Saad Al-Rubayan from Kuwait. Do you have any country-focused reports on Kuwait? Of course, Saad, you would ask that question. How does 200 participants make a sample size sufficient to be generalizable? Is that something you'd like to take up?
Sure. As we mentioned, we do 3,400 interviews across the region in 17 countries with 200 interviews in each country. And the 200 number is, while it's, the margin of error is higher, but that's the reason that we primarily focus on findings across the region. And, we show some regional differences between GCC, Levant, and North Africa. We only show country-specific findings when we truly feel like, our margin of error actually, what we're seeing is, statistically significant rather than just noise because of the sample size. That's our approach, to mostly focus on the regional numbers, and then where we can draw some conclusions in the countries. We do that, and I think what's interesting is that if you look at, again, tracking data, if you look at how the data tracks, we're not seeing any big jumps in countries on things that we cannot explain about. If we're seeing changes in data, we can find, hypotheses what's causing those changes.
Yeah, and Saad, we do have a country report. We've actually get country reports which we share with the government and private sector in those countries, and we have one that we will, if you're interested, we can share with you. But we feel our methodology is robust. It has a margin of error of plus minus 1.76, and as per international research guidelines, this is a good sample to have. Remember, these are not online, these are face-to-face interviews, so the reliability of these insights are very good, and we think we have been able to do that over the last 12 years to be able to, as Dom said, track those results, and that's what is the big treasure that we have been able to build over 12 years, the data of how things are changing over these tumultuous years. The last 12 years has seen dramatic changes. And just to give you one example, Saad, in the years 2008, 9, and 10, if you go back to our reports, and all our reports are archived in our Arab Youth Survey, you will see one of the most important finding was that young people in these countries, in those years, wanted to live in a democracy. So for any perceptive person, learning and studying those reports would say, hey, there's something happening here. And lo and behold, you had the Arab Spring happening in 2011. So we could some of these major events that define the region, you could actually see happening in those reports, and that's what we think is the most important part. I think we've run out of time. We thank you very much for your interest and for those questions. We are always available to provide more answers. Do send us an email on avais@bcw-global.com. But you can, I urge you to look at, spend some time on our website, arabyouthsurvey.com, download and read the white paper report, which is much more detailed with expert comments. And I'm sure you will find it very, very interesting. I once again thank you for the time that you've given us. We enjoyed presenting it to you, both me and my colleagues across the region as well as internationally, and have a good day. Thank you very much.